are optimal. So let me know how the sound is in just a moment. Where's it at? Here we go. Okay, in just a moment I'll be checking for your feedback. I'm still sick. I've got a cold. My throat hurts. I'm nasally. Sinuses are clogged. But we're going to power through. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. How's this sound? How's the sound? My channel. There we go. Alright, so I will be getting to the book in just a moment. As soon as I verify, as soon as I can see the live chat and see that the sound is coming through. There's a little bit of noise in the background. I'm at a shipyard getting my boat worked on. So please forgive me for any background noise. There's nothing I can do about it. Sound is good. Okay, we are continuing then. Okay, so let me see if anyone... I'm not going to moderate the chat today, so now that I know that everything is going good with the sound, I'm going to begin reading Hitler's Revolution where I left off. Let's see, where did I leave off? And, let me initiate the offline recording. Okay, starting the offline recording. Okay, we're continuing with chapter 4 here. Soviet propaganda simultaneously idealized traditional Russian national heroes such as Tsar Peter the Great, Alexander Nevsky, Alexander Suvorov, who had defeated the Turks in the late 18th century. These circumstances, the Germans interpreted as a shift in Soviet policy from communist internationalism to domestic patriotism. A nationalist Russia was a palatable ally for Hitler. In their endeavors to isolate Germany, the democracies drove him into Stalin's arms. On March 10, 1939, Stalin delivered a foreign policy speech at the Communist Party Congress. He denounced Britain, France, and the United States for their press campaigns to incite Germany into a war against the Soviet Union. He defined his objective as, quote, to observe events cautiously without giving the war provocateurs who are accustomed to letting others pull their chestnuts out of the fire for them the opportunity to drag our country into a conflict, end quote. Ribbentrop noted, quote, this declaration by Stalin showed that he was thinking about a path to a German-Soviet understanding, end quote. When the Germans marched into Prague a few days later, the Russians cooperated with Hitler's diplomatic restructuring of Bohemia, Moravia. In April, the German press discontinued criticism of the Soviet Union. Hitler considered Stalin's dismissal of Litvinov on May 3, 1939, the decisive step towards rapprochement. A Foreign Affairs Commissar, Litvinov had established diplomatic relations with the USA, brought the USSR into the League of Nations, concluded mutual assistance pacts with Czechoslovakia and France, and promoted an alliance system against Germany. Though Stalin himself ran foreign policy, the removal of the representative publicly associated with, quote, collective security, unquote, was a gesture that impressed Hitler. On May 10th, the Fuhrer discussed the Soviet question with foreign policy advisors Gustav Hilger and Julius Schnurre. Hilger gave Hitler a detailed report on Moscow's endeavors for the last 3 years to improve relations. Less than a month before, for example, Soviet Ambassador Alexei Marakalov had told Weizsäcker that there was no reason not to normalize and consistently strengthen Soviet-German ties. On May 9th, the Russian diplomat Georgy Astachov had told Schnur that Stalin was prepared to conclude a non-aggression pact with Germany. He also thanked the Reich's Foreign Office for recent correct press coverage of the Soviet Union. And just a comment here, this is all a trap. They're lulling the Germans into a false sense of security on their eastern border. In reality, within 2 years, the Soviets will be preparing for a massive offensive against Germany, and they catch the Soviets with their pants down then. So we'll get to that in a bit. On June 6, Berlin hosted a parade of German military personnel who had served in the Spanish Civil War. In his welcoming speech, Hitler avoided criticism of the Bolshevik menace which had threatened Spain. He denounced, instead, the Western democracies for mendacious news reporting. Quote, "For years, British and French newspapers lied to their readers, claiming Germany and Italy intended to conquer Spain, divide her up, and especially steal her colonies. This way of thinking seems more natural to the representatives of these countries than us, since robbing colonies is already among acceptable and practiced methods of the democracies." End quote. Around this time, Stalin conducted trade negotiations with Anglo-French delegates, not very sincerely, but to indirectly pressure Germany to ally with the USSR. Hitler realized that cooperation with the Russians offered the best chance to tip the scales in his country's favor. Were Moscow to join forces with the Western powers, the Reich would become economically and militarily encircled. The Kremlin hosted an Anglo-French military delegation in August. At the conference, Voroshilov offered to commit 120 infantry divisions, 16 cavalry divisions, and 10,000 tanks to invade Germany in the event of war. Oh, wow. So, yeah, that's a lot. France's General Joseph Dumenque and England's Admiral Reginald Drax, second-rate negotiators with limited authority, proposed a more or less defensive strategy, a token commitment compared to what the Russians were pledging. So here the Russians were pledging infinity troops to invade Germany with. Voroshilov insisted that the alliance would be contingent on the Red Army's right to cross Poland and Romania to reach the German frontier. Since both these buffer states controlled territory taken from Russia in 1919, their governments justifiably feared that once allowed in, the Soviets would permanently occupy the borderline regions, which of course they later did, but Bucharest and Warsaw rejected the proposal, and the talks failed. Moscow made no attempt to negotiate directly with the Poles to win their cooperation, an indication of Stalin's blasé attitude toward a compact with the Allies. So there was no need for the Soviets to make any real deals with the Western democracies because the Jew banks were already making sure that Soviet Russia received anything they could want materially and through trade. So there's a picture here. Arriving in Moscow airport on August 23, 1939, Ribbentrop left, speaks with Vladimir Potemkin, Deputy Commissar for Foreign Affairs in the USSR. That month, the USSR concluded an expansive trade agreement with the German Reich. On August 19th, the new Foreign Affairs Commissar Vyacheslav Molotov told the German ambassador, Count Friedrich von Schulenburg, quote, "To ensure the success of economic negotiations, a corresponding political basis must be created." End quote. He proposed a non-aggression pact, something the Russians had first suggested to the Germans in July 1936. Hitler avoided the example of his Western adversaries who had offered the Soviets by sending second-class representatives to the military talks in Moscow. He telegraphed to Stalin an offer to dispatch Ribbentrop himself. He stated, quote, "The Reich's Foreign Ministry has full authority for the wording and signing of the non-aggression pact, as well as the protocol," end quote. Stalin replied on August 21st, inviting Ribbentrop to fly to Moscow for a meeting on the 23rd. Stalin personally participated in the conference. He demanded that Germany recognize the Baltic states, Finland, and Bessarabia as Soviet spheres of influence. He promised his guests that the USSR did not wish to disturb the inner structure of these lands. Yeah, right. Anyhow, regarding Poland, Stalin recommended that the signatories fix a demarcation line in the event of war to prevent German-Soviet friction when dividing the country. Ribbentrop reassured his host that the Reich's new Soviet orientation represents a fundamental shift in foreign policy and is not a tactical maneuver to enable Germany to isolate and crush Poland. He assured Stalin, quote, "From the German side, everything will be attempted to resolve the matter in a diplomatic and peaceful way," end quote. On August 24th, the German delegation flew back to Berlin with the signed pact. Hitler did not regard the treaty as a green light to attack Poland, but continued fruitless attempts at negotiation for another week. With war underway in September, Ribbentrop cabled the German mission in Moscow to press the Soviets to occupy the eastern half of Poland according to the secret protocol. He hoped to draw the USSR into a war against England and France. Molotov stalled for 2 weeks. Stalin finally ordered the Red Army to advance on September 17th. The Germans had already driven the Poles back 120 miles beyond the demarcation line. Stalin feared that Hitler's troops would keep the additional territory instead of relinquishing it to Soviet forces. Upon Poland's defeat, the German and Soviet armies staged a joint military parade at Brest-Litovsk. Having eliminated Poland as a military threat, Hitler hoped to reach a compromise with England and France. He planned to offer to restore sovereignty to the Czech state and to western Poland. Ribbentrop had advised the Soviet government of this intention in a note on September 15th. At a conference with the OKW on October 17th, Hitler stated, quote, "Poland shall be made independent. It will not become part of the German realm, nor be under the administration of the Reich." End quote. 2 weeks later, Molotov expressed Moscow's position on Poland. Quote, "Nothing is left of this miscarriage of the Versailles Treaty, which owed its existence to the suppression of non-Polish nationalities." End quote. Stalin sent a telegram to Ribbentrop on December 27th, reminding him that, quote, "The friendship of the peoples of Germany and the Soviet Union," end quote, "has been, quote, forged in blood," end quote, "on the battlefields of Poland. Any endeavor to resurrect the Polish state," Stalin pleaded, "was therefore contrary to the spirit. Aware of his country's dependency on Soviet trade, Hitler abandoned the plan to reestablish Polish statehood. Stalin sought to stifle any action that might bring Germany and the Allies to the conference table." Wow. So this is Jews on both sides messing things up, making sure there isn't any peace. So Hitler wanted to do with Poland what he had done with the Czechs, which was give them their own state and then leave them to it. And Stalin said that he couldn't do that, or else, there'd be trouble. So, on November 30th, 1939, the Red Army invaded Finland. The Finns did nothing to prompt the attack beyond refusing Moscow's demands to cede portions of their frontier territory and some islands of the Gulf of Finland to the USSR. The Russians described their quote-unquote counterattack as a response to, quote, provocations of Finnish militarists, end quote. The 3.5-month winter war that followed cost the Finnish army 27,000 dead and 55,000 wounded. The Red Army lost 126,875 killed in action and 264,908 wounded. Though German public opinion overwhelmingly favored Finland, Hitler blocked attempts by the Allies to deliver war materials to the Finns via Norway. The Führer personally penned an unattributed editorial defining the government's position on Scandinavia, which the German press published in early December. Quote, "Since the establishment of the League of Nations, the northern states were the most loyal supporters of this system, whose only purpose was to perpetually tie down Germany. When National Socialism took power in Germany, scarcely a day passed that many newspapers of the northern states did not vent their arrogant and insulting criticism of German policies. It is naive and sentimental to expect that the German people, fighting for their future, should presently side with these little countries that previously couldn't do enough to revile and discredit Germany." End quote. Fearing Anglo-French intervention, Stalin suspended operations in Finland in March 1940, just as his army had gained the upper hand. He demanded little more than the territories the USSR sought to annex during negotiations with Helsinki the previous October. The Soviets soon dispelled any goodwill such mild terms evoked. Less than a week after concluding the peace treaty in Moscow, the Russians realized that the newly defined frontier left the town of Enso just inside the Finnish border. It was home to one of the world's largest complexes for manufacture of paper and cellulose. The latter is a polymer necessary for producing high-grade explosives. The Red Army simply crossed into Finland and occupied Enso. On June 2, 1940, the Soviets demanded restitution for wares the Finns had allegedly evacuated during the fighting from areas now under Russian control. No provision for this compensation existed in the original Moscow Treaty. Finland had surrendered 75 locomotives and 2,000 freight cars to the USSR. On June 14th, Soviet fighters shot down a Finnish passenger plane flying French and American diplomats to Helsinki. The Soviets deported the entire population, 42,000 persons, from the part of Finland now under their control. So there's a picture of a poster here. This Soviet poster idealizes the 1939 invasion of Karelia. It reads, "For a red Petrograd, for a red Finland." Yeah. Soviet pressure on Finland became a German problem. In April 1940, Schnurre negotiated a trade agreement with Helsinki. It allowed the Reich to purchase 60% of Finnish nickel ore necessary for steel production. Germany mined just 5% of her own nickel requirements. In June, the USSR insisted on the option to purchase a large amount of Finnish output. Since the Soviet Union already enjoyed sufficient domestic production, the Germans viewed Moscow's initiative as a ploy to make the Reich more dependent on Russia for raw materials. Admiral Nikolai Nesvitsky, the Soviet Baltic Sea Fleet, submitted a confidential report on how to, quote, solve the problem of the independent existence of Sweden and Finland, end quote. The Soviets prepared plans for a renewed invasion of Finland in September. The German-Finnish trade agreement signed on June 24th made Finland an important source of natural resources for the Reich's war industry. In August 1940, the OKW received intelligence about Soviet troop concentrations near the Finnish frontier. Upon Hitler's orders, the Germans reinforced their army and Luftwaffe contingents in northern Norway. They gave the Finns the Allied ordnance originally intended for the winter war against Russia, which the German army had confiscated in Norwegian ports. Finland arranged to begin discreetly purchasing German weapons as well. During the winter of 1940 and 1941, the Soviets broke a trade agreement with Helsinki and suspended grain deliveries to Finland. The Finns turned to Germany to fill the void, strengthening the bond between the two countries. The USSR moved against the other countries which the 1939 German-Soviet Pact deemed as Soviet spheres of interest. Late that year, Moscow had pressured Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia to sign treaties permitting the Red Banner Fleet to establish naval bases in their Baltic ports. In June 1940, Moscow complained of insufficient protection for Russian military personnel stationed there. An ultimatum followed, forcing the governments of the three Baltic nations to allow the Soviets to reinforce the garrisons. The Red Army sent 18 to 20 divisions. This overwhelming military martial presence enabled communists there to declare the Baltic countries Soviet republics on July 21st, following sham elections and a, quote, popular uprising, end quote. During Soviet, and there's a picture here with Stalin and some other politicians, it says, during Soviet sham elections in the Baltic countries in January 1941, a political commissar helps validate the identity of registered voters. The poster depicts Stalin and Molotov. Stalin sent two representatives, Zhdanov and Vyzhinsky, to rid the territory of political undesirables. The Soviets deported over 140,000 Estonians and 155 Latvians and 300,000 Lithuanians to Siberian labor camps. Scarcely any ever returned. Referring to the USSR's occupation of the Baltic states and simultaneous seizure of Bessarabia from Romania, Stalin told the Communist Party Central Committee on September 40th, Quote, "This is a blessing for humanity. The Lithuanians, White Russians, and Bessarabians, whom we have liberated from the oppression by landowners, capitalists, policemen, and similar scum, consider themselves lucky. This is the people's attitude." End quote. And there's a picture here. Young Latvians march in the 1941 Soviet May Day parade. Their expressions indicate that participation in this celebration of proletarian unity was not exactly voluntary, and these women do not look happy at all. They look pissed. They look sad. Anyhow, I'm sure they were all getting raped. During these Soviet land grabs, world attention focused on Western Europe. On April 1940, the German army forces occupied Norway and Denmark. The following month, the Germans invaded Holland, Belgium, and France, all three of which surrendered within 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force withdrew to England. Germany so smoothly vanquished her continental adversaries that Britain went over to the defense. The protracted war of attrition Stalin had predicted would wear out the, quote, capitalist states did not materialize. The ice augmenting influence over the European economy partially relieved its dependency on Soviet trade. The rapid German victory unsettled Stalin, who expressed the opinion that war with Germany was inevitable. So, in case you missed it earlier, Stalin had said earlier that he was waiting for the Western democracies in Germany to get involved in another World War I trench war. And when they were both exhausted, for the Soviets to invade and take over all of Europe right through to England. And, well, Stalin didn't count on the Germans being so good at war when they're forced to it, so that didn't happen. And then Stalin comes right out and says, we're going to need to do war with Germany. Soviet expansion disquieted Hitler. The Russian efforts to improve relations with England, still at war with Germany, compounded his suspicions. On April 23, 1940, Weizsäcker telegraphed Karl von Litte, a secretary in the German embassy in Moscow, that, quote, "Yesterday almost every London newspaper wrote about Soviet-English economic talks supposedly started on Soviet initiative." End quote. Excuse me. Weizsäcker directed the German mission to inform Molotov, quote, "With respect to the course so far of Soviet deliveries of raw materials, the Reichsgovernment is not satisfied that they correspond to its perception of mutual assistance. It implores the Soviet government to increase and continue deliveries during the months favorable for transportation and immediately get larger shipments of oil and grain in motion." Moscow negotiated a trade agreement with London while simultaneously slackening on obligations to Germany. The British ambassador, Sir Stafford Cripps, conferred with Stalin in July, to win Russia for an anti-German alliance. Cripps promised that England would accept Soviet control over the Dardanelles, the Balkans, eastern Poland, and practically any arrangement for post-war Europe Stalin wanted. Considering traditional British foreign policy, these were lavish concessions. The Soviet dictator confided that he considered Germany the only threat. He more or less opened the door to an alliance with London. Aware that the conference with Cripps would arouse mistrust in Berlin, Stalin ordered Molotov to provide the German ambassador with a written summary of the talks. The Molotov version, which Schulenburg forwarded to his government, gave the impression that Stalin had remained loyal to the German alliance and rejected the Cripps proposals. However, Hitler received more reliable information from Rome. Italian agents were secretly monitoring the dispatches of the Yugoslavian ambassador in Moscow, Milan Gavrilovic, to Belgrade. This intelligence they relayed to Berlin. Gavrilovic wrote about Moscow's intent in signing with England. In this way, Hitler learned of Stalin's duplicity. So now Hitler finds out that he's getting two-timed, that Stalin is gearing up for war against Germany and working out an alliance with Britain and France and America as well. Also during July, Hitler and Ribbentrop began mediating a border dispute between Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. The Red Army massed along the common frontier with Romania. It prepared to invade and, quote, restore order if war broke out among the Balkan states. Reports of Soviet troop concentrations in Bessarabia induced Hitler to order 2 German armored divisions stationed in southwestern Poland plus 10 infantry divisions to rapidly occupy the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești in case the region became unstable. On August 24th, the Hungarian-Romanian talks broke down. Hitler forced their diplomats back to the conference table. Germany's powerful economic influence in the region, together with justifiable fear of Soviet intervention, led them to accept the Führer's arbitration. At a session conducted by Ribbentrop and Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano in Vienna on August 30th, Romania agreed to cede the northern part of Siebenbürgen to Hungary. In exchange, Germany and Italy guaranteed Romania against foreign aggression. Upon Bucharest's request, the Germans dispatched a military mission including mechanized troops and Air Force units to train and upgrade the Romanian army in October. So the Central European states just to the east of Austria and towards the Balkans saw the writing on the wall, saw what happened to Finland, and wanted German protection, and they got it. Moscow had contributed to the crisis by attempting to provoke Hungary and Bulgaria against Romania. The Kremlin now protested that the Vienna arbitration violated Article 2 of the German-Soviet Pact. The 1939 treaty required consultation in questions of mutual interest, but the Russians had not been invited to negotiations in Vienna. Ribbentrop replied that Soviet interests in the Balkans had already been satisfied with the occupation of Bessarabia in June. He reminded Molotov that the USSR seized all of Lithuania, including a portion defined as a German sphere of influence, without notifying Berlin. Ribbentrop argued that German diplomatic intervention in the Balkan controversy had restored stability to a region bordering the Soviet Union, which could only be in Moscow's interests. Well, they must have known that Moscow wanted to annex all that, but oh well. Molotov responded in a memorandum on September 21st, 1940. He disputed Ribbentrop's position, complaining that the German-Italian guarantee for Romania is directed against the USSR. Parenthetical here. Its actual purpose was to protect Romania from Hungary, whose region was unsatisfied with the final arrangement. End parenthetical. Although the Germans addressed Molotov in a manner the Romanian foreign minister described as, quote, well-meaning and conciliatory, end quote, relations between Moscow and Berlin cooled that summer. Regarding the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states in June, the German ambassador in Riga wrote to his superiors, quote, pro-Russian circles are for the moment claiming with great vehemence that the entire action is directed against Germany, and in a short time an offensive into German territory will begin, end quote. And that they had later found maps proving that to be the case, but moving on. Soviet authorities in Bessarabia advised ethnic Germans settled there not to exercise the option to migrate to Germany. They explained that the Red Army would invade the Reich soon, so there was no point in moving. Okay, so there you go. In October, the Germans came into possession of an original Soviet military document containing a plan to attack Romania and capture Ploiești. And that was, of course, Romania and that oil-rich region were huge partners with Germany. Germans were giving them all sorts of industrial equipment in exchange for oil. That was a critical trading partner for Germany that the Soviets were planning on invading. The Soviet Chief of Staff, Georgy Zhukov, transferred the 5th, 9th, and 12th Armies to Bessarabia, deploying them 110 miles from the Romanian oil fields. The 9th Army alone possessed more tanks than the entire German armed forces. So, you have to remember the Jew bankers had financed the Soviet Union and had made sure that trade from America and all the other countries had given them heavy industry, and the Soviet Union had just been mass-producing tanks. They had tons and tons of tanks. And just one of the many armies of the Soviet Union had more tanks than the entire German armed forces put together. So this whole German war machine thing is a myth. Germany was horribly prepared for this war. They didn't want war. They had thought they would have been able to peacefully seek German interests, which of course the Jew bankers and the Jew Bolsheviks were never going to allow to happen. On October 13th, Ribbentrop wrote Stalin, suggesting that Molotov visit Berlin. Stalin accepted, sending his foreign affairs commissar on November 12th. During the conferences, the Führer reminded his guests of Germany's support during the Finnish War and regarding the military occupation of the Baltic states and of Bessarabia. He argued that Germany and Russia always profited when working together. When they turned against one another, the only foreign powers benefited. Hitler told Molotov that Germany had no political interest in Finland, but urgently needed her trade to acquire nickel and lumber. The only German troops there were en route to northern Norway to transfer soon to be completed. He emphasized that Germany requires peace in the Baltic Sea region to continue the war against Britain, which, of course, behind closed doors, Moscow was getting along with fantastically. Sorry about the nasally voice. I'm pretty congested and sick today, but we're going to keep doing this. Hitler and Ribbentrop, who remained cordial and patient throughout the conferences, urged Soviet expansion southwards toward Persia and India. Molotov showed no interest in this suggestion. He repeatedly returned to his demands for increased Soviet influence over Finland and the Balkans, especially Bulgaria. The meeting, which ended with Molotov's departure on November 14th, failed to reach a viable compromise. This compelled Hitler to gradually transfer more troops into the Reich's eastern frontier to hold possible Soviet expansion in check. As a result, he lacked adequate military resources to subdue England. By weakening Germany and indirectly encouraging the British to continue their resistance, Stalin prevented a conclusion of the fighting in the West. An event beyond Hitler's control further disrupted Soviet-German relations. On October 28th, Italy, having entered the war on Germany's side in June, launched an unprovoked invasion of Greece. Mussolini's troops suffered heavy losses and made no progress. The tenacity of the Greek defenders, mountainous terrain, bad weather, and poor leadership and ordnance of the Italian army hampered the offensive. Italian defeats in Greece and Libya against the British substantially lowered Axis prestige among European neutrals. The Italian press simultaneously publicized Mussolini's claims to certain Yugoslavian territories as well. In August, Yugoslavia's regent, Prince Paul, told the German newspaper in Belgrade, Victor von Herren, quote, regarding the attitude toward Germany's position on this aggressive policy of Italy's is of the greatest significance. The people respect Germany, but have contempt for Italy, end quote. A Yugoslavian diplomat, whom the Germans bribed, revealed to Berlin details of Moscow's endeavors to win the Balkans for a pan-Slavic anti-German coalition. In December, Hitler directed the OKW to plan a military expedition against Greece. Athens began accepting British aid. Were the Royal Air Force to transfer bomber squadrons to Greek airfields, they would be within range of Plötzi, and this again is the oil fields. The Germans needed to prevent England from forming a second front in southeastern Europe against Germany, protect the Romanian oil wells, as well as help the Italian army bogged down in Greece. Hitler hoped that a strong German military presence would persuade Athens to compromise and conclude a peace with Italy. The prospect vanished when British troop contingents landed on March 10, 1941 to reinforce the Greeks. And Hitler had let so many... Hitler forgot he was in a war. He kept on trying to make peace when he was never going to be able to get it. Anyway, moving on. The Soviet Union objected when the Germans concentrated troops in southern Romania in January. The German 12th Army planned to cross from there into Bulgaria at the beginning of March and deploy along the country's border with Greece. On January 13th, the Soviet news agency TASS announced that the transfer of German troops to Bulgaria was taking place. quote, neither with the knowledge nor the approval of the USSR, end quote. Berlin responded that the operation was necessary to keep British forces off the continent. Ribbentrop publicly fixed the strength of the 12th Army on February 12th at the exaggerated figure of 680,000 men. This included, quote, an especially high percentile of technological troops with the most modern ordnance, especially armored personnel, end quote. The purpose of the boast was to discourage the Russians from risking a military confrontation. They protested in a memorandum to the German Foreign Office, quote, the Soviet government regards the presence of any armed force on Bulgarian territory as a threat to the security of the USSR, end quote. Yugoslavia joined Germany's alliance system, the Three-Power Pact, on March 25th. Even though the Reich purchased grain from the country, there was a strong pan-Slavic movement in Yugoslavia and the armed forces leadership, which was hostile toward Germany. 2 days later, a military coup toppled the government. The army arrested prominent members of the former administration. The new head of state, General Dusan Simovic, confided to the British that he needed time to upgrade his armed forces, but would then join with the USA, England, and Russia to attack the Germans. Hitler disbelieved Simovic's public pledge to respect Yugoslavia's obligation to the Three Powers Pact. The very day of the coup, the Führer told the OKW, quote, Yugoslavia must also be considered an enemy and therefore be beaten as quickly as possible, end quote. Moscow congratulated the new regime in Belgrade by telegram declaring that the, quote, Yugoslavian people have again proven worthy of their glorious past, end quote. Hungary's regent Nicholas von Horthy warned Hitler, quote, Yugoslavia could scarcely have let herself be led down this path without a certain Soviet influence, end quote. The German army invaded Yugoslavia and Greece on April 6. Although American newspapers estimated the British expeditionary force in Greece at 240,000 men, the Germans more accurately fixed its strength at around 60,000. Handicapped by ethnic dissonance within its ranks, unpreparedness, and a poor command structure, the Yugoslavian army failed to offer cohesive resistance against the Germans. The Greek army fared no better. The British troops, who, according to the German combat correspondent, quote, got drunk during the day and chased girls at night, end quote, soon prepared to evacuate the mainland. The German armed forces occupied both countries with minimal losses. Here's a picture of German mountain infantrymen, Gebirgsjäger, negotiate Greece's picturesque, uneven terrain during the Balkan campaign in April 1941. Well, that's great preparation for the battles to come in the Caucasus. But unfortunately, they stopped just north of the Caucasus Mountains. They really should have pushed straight through to Persia. But that's a different subject. And that's also a few years later. We'll talk about that later. The Balkan debacle strained German-Soviet rapprochement. Moscow had concluded a non-aggression pact with the Soviet regime on April 5th. Hitler correctly judged this as an unfriendly gesture. German soldiers discovered documents in Belgrade supporting this opinion. One found in the Soviet embassy read, quote, the USSR will only react at a given moment. The Axis powers have largely scattered their fighting forces, and for this reason the USSR will suddenly move against Germany, end quote. So another admission that the Soviets were planning on attacking Germany. German diplomatic analyst Ernst Bormann prepared a summary of the former Yugoslavian foreign minister's correspondence. Bormann concluded that the Soviets, quote, encouraged Yugoslavia toward eventual opposition against Germany, ... The Soviets are making hasty preparations, end quote. Prince Veit, the German ambassador in Stockholm, cabled Berlin on May 16th, quote, the Soviet-Russian representative here, Mr. Alexandra Kollontai, said today, as I found out, that in no time in Russian history have stronger troop contingents been concentrated on the western frontier of Russia than at present, end quote. Hitler received ominous signs of potential Soviet belligerency from other sources as well. From Helsinki came an encrypted telegram relating how the Soviet naval attaché there, Smirnov, disclosed to his American colleague Hutsteiner that, quote, Russia will, in all probability, have to enter the war on the side of the other great democracies, end quote. The German counterintelligence chief, Walter Schellenberg, reported a dramatic increase in Soviet espionage, subversion, and sabotage. Harbor police in various European ports captured dock workers placing explosives aboard German, Italian, or Japanese merchant ships. In most cases, the perpetrators were communist agents. The Danish criminal police broke up a particularly destructive ring of communist saboteurs run by Ernst Wohlweber. Since 1938, its members had smuggled explosives aboard and sunk nearly 70 vessels bound from Scandinavian ports for Germany. The OKW registered daily Soviet reconnaissance flights over German airspace. It continuously supplied Hitler with assessments of steadily augmenting Russian forces deploying along the mutual frontier. This actively assumed, quote, in increasing proportion a threatening character, end quote. 5 weeks after the abortive talks with Molotov in November 1940, Hitler ordered the OKW to plan for an offensive against the USSR. He deliberated for the next several months on whether to exercise the option. After the fall of France, the Führer decided that a direct invasion of the British Isles was too risky. The alternative strategy of challenging English power in the Mediterranean depended largely on the capture of Gibraltar for success. The Germans could not launch an operation against this salient British position unless Spain entered the war, but Franco chose neutrality. With American aid for England mounting, Hitler saw no way of ending the war. The shift in Soviet orientation toward the west evoked the specter of an Anglo-American Soviet alliance. The Russians could strike at Germany's flank, Finland and Romania without warning. This could curtail vital deliveries of nickel and petroleum. So, if Russia did, or if the Soviets did that, Germany wouldn't be able to make steel or put any fuel in its tanks or planes. So, the Führer sensed the strategic initiative passing to the hands of the enemies. Only a dramatic thrust could rescue the situation, delivering a knockout blow to Russia before she could join forces with the USA and confront Germany with an overwhelming military coalition. Eliminating the Soviet threat in a rapid campaign would enable the Reich to consolidate its position in Europe and concentrate on the war against England. A victory over the USSR would also strengthen Japan's influence in the Far East. Hitler believed that taking Russia out of the game would influence London to conclude a peace with Germany and discourage American intervention. In April 1941, the Soviet government permitted a delegation of engineers from German armaments manufacturers, including Mauser, Henschel, and Daimler-Benz, to tour aeronautic research and production faculties inside the USSR. The organization, size, and quality of the installations made a telling impression on the visitors. In a detailed evaluation prepared for the Reichsair Ministry, the German delegates described, among other things, a single Soviet airplane engine factory that was larger than 6 German plants combined. Göring and the Luftwaffe staff considered the report exaggerated. He denounced the armaments engineers as defeatists who have fallen victim to a Soviet ruse. Hitler, however, took the analysis seriously. He remarked, "You see how far these people have come. We'd better get started," end quote. Since 1939, in fact, mass production of modern combat aircraft in the Soviet Union had increased by 70%. Though Hitler did not necessarily consider the Russians an immediate military threat, the danger their expanding armaments program posed down the road was of great concern. Though German army commanders harbored reservations about starting a two-front war, most were optimistic about the prospects of a swift victory over the USSR. The German General Staff predicted a campaign of 2 to 4 months. Chief of Staff Franz Hader underestimated the strength of the Red Army by half. And Foreign Armies East, a branch of German Army intelligence, also understated the size of the Red Army. Analysts fixed the number of armored divisions at 10. In reality, the Soviets possessed 100 mechanized divisions, all with armor. So this is the Abwehr feeding Hitler bad intel. And we'll find out more about that later. The Germans received another disparaging assessment of Russian capabilities from Japan. The Soviet secret police chief in Manchuria, General Lushkov, defected to the Japanese in 1938. They forwarded the transcripts of his interrogation to the German embassy in Tokyo. Lushkov described the disorganization and incompetence of Red Army leadership. He offered examples demonstrating that the political structure inside the USSR was unstable, and in the event of major war, the entire system would collapse. Pursuant to the tradition of the Foreign Office. Actually, I'm going to take a brief break here. I'll be back in a few minutes. Pause my offline recording. Leave you with some music. Okay, I'll resume the offline recording here. Okay, and we're back to continuing Chapter 4 of Hitler's Revolution. The Germans received another disparaging assessment of Russian capabilities from Japan. Oh, I already read that one. Pursuant to the tradition of the Foreign Office, Ribbentrop tenaciously argued for a compromise with Moscow. On January 10, 1941, economist Schnurr signed an expansive trade agreement with the Soviet Union, surpassing in scope all previous compacts and clearing away potential bottlenecks in Germany's supply of raw materials. In addition to providing the Reich with Russian oil, cotton, fodder, phosphates, iron ore, scrap metal, chrome, and platinum, the Soviets purchased rubber in the Far East from the Germans and delivered it by rail. The Reich furnished industrial machinery and armaments in return. Schnurr and Ribbentrop presented the trade agreement to Hitler at the Berghof on January 26. In his lecture, Schnurr pointed out that it would nullify the effects of the English continental blockade. As this was virtually London's only hope for victory, Schnurr concluded that the Russian treaty, quote, is a firm basis for an honorable and great peace for Germany, end quote. Hitler replied that he cannot give priority to the deliveries necessary for Germany to uphold the new trade agreement. The military situation in the Mediterranean, including North Africa, compelled him to give precedence to the requirements of the German, Italian armed forces. Schnurr wrote later that Ribbentrop's bearing, quote, clearly demonstrated that at this time he opposed the Russian war, end quote. After some wrangling, the two diplomats persuaded Hitler to approve the treaty. Despite the war against Britain, the Germans were in a solid bargaining position with respect to the Soviet Union in January 1941. They largely dominated the European economy, and the success of their armed forces against Poland and France had impressed Soviet leaders. The Red Army General Boris Shaposhnikov overestimated the number of tanks and aircraft available to the German armed forces by more than double. The German military was far superior to Finland's, whose soldiers had previously inflicted heavy losses on the Red Army despite being outnumbered. Further, Stalin mistrusted the British. During the 1940 French campaign, the Germans had captured and published Allied plans to use air bases in Turkey to bomb the Russian oil fields in Baku, even though the USSR was a non-belligerent. The purpose was to indirectly disrupt Germany's fuel supply. And Baku's an oil-rich region down by the Caucasus. In some respects, Stalin regarded Germany as a buffer between the USSR and the capitalist powers. He told Ribbentrop, quote, I will never tolerate Germany becoming weak, end quote. The Russian historian Irina Pavlova summarized, quote, for Stalin, the growing power of National Socialism was a positive factor in the evolution of international relations because, in his view, it aggravated the dissonance between the principal capitalist powers, end quote. Were Germany and Russia to come to blows, Stalin would indeed, quote, pull the chestnuts out of the fire, end quote, for the democracies, something he himself warned against in 1939. So just a few things to remember here. Stalin was hoping that Germany and the Western democracies would have a long trench war like the case was in 1914 to 1919. This didn't happen. The Germans had the Blitzkrieg, superior tactics and superior morale and training, and the Allied soldiers knew that they weren't really fighting for anything that concrete. They were fighting for these abstract international ideals. The Germans were fighting for the security of Europe, and so German morale was magnitudes higher than Allied morale. And actually, when the French went over to the Germans, they became fanatical soldiers for European liberation forces. You have to remember here also at this time, Stalin was beginning to purge the Trotskyites, or had begun to purge the Trotskyites in the early to mid-30s. And the Jews were losing influence in the Soviet Union. Quite a bit. More than the Jews in America knew. Stalin was becoming a Slavic nationalist. And this later laid the foundation for a return for Russia to traditionalism, as was already starting to happen in the academies and stuff. The Jews were essentially being purged from the Soviet power structure, although they were still overrepresented. And It was only once Stalin began really purging the Jews in the late 30s that the Russians began having something they saw worth fighting for, which was their nationality as opposed to these Jew Bolsheviks. So there are all sorts of different factors here shifting, and it's hard to keep track of all of it. But in the end, Stalin, whether he was loyal to the Jews before, was certainly wishing to overthrow the banksters himself, even though the banksters had initially set up the Soviet Union that Stalin essentially commandeered from them. And this is why, at the end of World War II, the Jewish newspapers in the West began printing all of this anti-Russian propaganda because the Jews were no longer in control of the Soviet Union. And I'm not saying the Soviet Union was good. I'm not really saying that Stalin was in the right here. I'm just saying that the Soviet Union was no longer the Jews' pet project. It was becoming a nationalistic force, a pan-Slavic force. Anyhow, the Reich's Foreign Office persistently opposed the plan to invade the USSR. Exasperated, Hitler called the unyielding Ribbentrop, quote, "my worst difficult subordinate," end quote. Schnurre even appealed to General Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl of the OKW to promote an understanding with the Kremlin. Quote, "I described the consequences of the Moscow negotiations and their great advantages for Germany, securing the supply of raw materials and a reserve of foodstuffs, plus far-reaching opportunities for trade with the East," end quote. Schnurre borrowed arguments about the expansiveness of Russia, her inexhaustible manpower pool, and a climate once employed by Marcus Augustin de Caulaincourt, who had advised Napoleon against invading the Czech's empire in 1812, or the Tsar's empire in 1812. Quote, "My explanation sadly fell on deaf ears," end quote. Schnurre recalled, quote, "Jodl answered that all this had been taken into account. From every indication it would be a short war," end quote. So the Abwehr was estimating Soviet strength at a fraction of what it really was. And Germany was operating based on bad intelligence from the Abwehr. And you're going to see later intentional sabotage of German efforts by feeding Hitler bad intelligence. You're going to see more of this later on in the book. And make sure this recording is still going. Yeah, good. The Soviet military leadership prepared two operational plans for an invasion of Central Europe, dated March 11th and May 15th, 1941. The latter study stated that the Red Army must, quote, "deploy before the enemy does and attack the German armed forces at the moment it is in the deployment stage and is as yet unable to organize the coordination of the individual branches of the service, end quote. A Soviet propaganda directive instructed journalists, quote, "The fighting in this war has demonstrated so far that a defensive strategy against superior motorized troop units brought no success and ended in defeat. An offensive strategy against Germany is therefore advisable, one which relies a great deal on technology," end quote. Whether Stalin ultimately decided to attack Germany or had a fixed date in mind is still a subject of debate. Thanks to German traitors, he received the text of Hitler's OKW directive to prepare an invasion plan of the USSR. Germany's support of Finland and military penetration into Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and Yugoslavia also worried the Soviet dictator. The Germans lagged on deliveries of machinery and weapons obligated by the treaty. By June 1941, the Red Army had massed 81.5% of its forces opposite German-controlled territory. Hitler opened hostilities on June 22, 1941, repeatedly warned by Keitel of the concentration of Soviet divisions on the frontier. Here's a picture of German troops. A scene from the German newsreel depicts infantrymen passing Soviet prisoners early in the Russian campaign. The Red Army's concentration on the frontier lent credence to the German propagandist claim that Stalin had been massing troops to invade Central Europe. In justifying his resolve to launch a campaign against Russia, Hitler told Ribbentrop, quote, "Sooner or later, the so-called East-West pincers will be engaged against Germany," end quote. Ribbentrop recalled after the war, quote, "Confronted with the danger of an attack from both sides, the Führer saw the foregoing elimination of the Soviet Union as the only way out." end quote. The decision came neither swiftly nor easily. His aide, Walter Havel, recalled the anxiety over whether or not to invade the USSR so tormented Hitler that he required medication to sleep. That's not good. Don't take meds to sleep. Democratic court historians, especially in post-war Germany, attribute the Russian campaign to Hitler's ambition to gain Lebensraum, or living space, in the East. The theory rests on a tenuous assumption, namely that deadlocked in a fight against the British and practically at war with the United States, Hitler launched a colonial expedition against one of the world's most powerful empires, the principal supplier of natural resources vital to Germany's wartime economy, in order to secure surplus land for future German settlers. So, I mean, just say that to yourself. That's a joke. Why would they launch a colonization program in the middle of a war that's on the Atlantic, on the Mediterranean, soon to be North Africa, Southern Europe, etc., etc.? They had their hands full. They didn't have resources to start a colonization project. So this was not about Lebensraum. This was about Germany being encircled and the plans of the Soviets to invade offensively into German-controlled territory. In truth, the Reich was short 1 million laborers in 1939, and the government offered incentives to foreign workers, especially Czechs, to migrate to Germany and fill vacancies in industry. After conquering Poland, Hitler told Mussolini that newly recovered German provinces like Posen would require 40 to 50 years to resettle and fully integrate into the economy. Where would Hitler find colonists to export to Russia? So, he didn't even have enough people to fill up Posen within 40 to 50 years, let alone settle all of the tracts of land that they would win from the Soviet Union. Further, the German Race and Resettlement Office promoted a program entitled, quote, "Come Home to the Reich," end quote, and encouraged ethnic Germans living in Poland, the Baltic states, and the Balkans to migrate into Germany. In this way, the state hoped to partially cover the manpower shortfall in the economy. Were Hitler planning to colonize Russia, he would not have authorized his agency to draw Germans living in the East home to the Reich. At no time did the question of Lebensraum enter Hitler's deliberations on whether or not to invade the Soviet Union. And the next section is called The Number One Enemy. Mercantile rivalry among nations is often the genesis of armed conflicts, though those profiting from the adventures publicly describe them as defensive wars or waged for altruistic reasons. The former U.S. President William Taft confessed that modern diplomacy is, quote, fundamentally commercial, end quote, but cloaked in, quote, idealistic feelings of humanitarianism and moral obligations, end quote. Regarding American hostility toward Germany, which plagued Hitler throughout his tenure in office, economic considerations played a major role. His country drained of gold reserves, Hitler created a novel money system to get the national economy back on its feet. Accordingly, capital came to represent human productivity. Work itself became money. Currency was no longer a commodity to be speculated upon, loaned at high interest, or wielded to manipulate economic life, but solely a means to facilitate transactions. This, just my comment here, yeah, that's exactly what I want for the United States. Let's get rid of the private Federal Reserve that's designed to enrich speculators, and let's figure out how to get just enough money to cover the transactions in the country and forbid these different speculative industries of parasitism that the Jews have set up in this country. And it's not all Jews, but these industries, the financial and speculation bubbles, these are all Jewish, because they control the central banks. Anyhow, moving on. Germany introduced new principles to international commerce as well. Hitler, in the words of the Canadian historian Helmut Gordon, quote, was firmly convinced that as long as the international monetary system remains based on the value of gold, nations able to hoard the most gold can force those nations lacking gold to their will, compelling others to accept loans at high interest rates to dissipate their assets. End quote. Hitler believed that a country's power of production should determine the strength of her economy and not the amount of gold in the treasury. So he wants a productivity-based economy, not a speculation-based economy. And that's what I want for the United States. Germany concluded trade agreements with 25 financially distressed countries in southeastern Europe, the Near East, and South America. The treaties based transactions on an exchange of wares without monetary payments. In return for foodstuffs and raw materials, Germany supplied poorer nations with agricultural machinery, locomotives, and manufactured goods. This was a barter system, which spared trade partners having to borrow from foreign banks to finance purchases, a relief for countries already in debt during the worldwide depression. Wow. So trade that actually has consideration rendered and not just, banknotes of you owe us money and IMF bullcrap designed to enslave your country with debt. You got something? We'll trade you something for it. That sounds like real economics to me. The mutually beneficial arrangement gradually deprived the United States, France, and Britain of markets they had previously dominated. Financial institutions in London and New York, accustomed to providing credit to smaller nations, lost a lucrative portion of their international commerce. British General Fuller wrote that Hitler's, quote, economic policy of direct barter and subsidized exports struck a deadly blow to British and American trade, end quote. Lord Forbes, belonging to an English trade commission visiting South America, warned, quote, we don't want Germans continuing to conduct their system of an exchange of goods and other disrespectful trade methods right under our nose, end quote. In other words, you gotta come borrow money from us to buy stuff from industrial nations. You can't just directly barter with third world countries. How are we supposed to get our interest? Anyhow, in 1941, President Roosevelt asked rhetorically, quote, will anyone suggest that Germany's attempt to dominate trade in Central Europe was not a major contributing factor to the war? End quote. Churchill remarked in 1938, quote, what we desire is the complete destruction of the German economy, end quote. He told Lord Robert Boothby, quote, Germany's most unforgivable crime before the Second World War was her attempt to extricate her economic power from the world's trading system and to create her own exchange mechanism which would deny world finance its opportunity to profit, end quote. Churchill just said it. I'm going to repeat that. This is key. Churchill remarked in 1938, what we desire is the complete destruction of the German economy, he told Lord Robert Boothby. Germany's most unforgivable crime before the Second World War was her attempt to extricate her economic power from the world's trading system and to create her own exchange mechanism which would deny world finance its opportunity to profit. Hello, this is about central banking. Just like Iran, just like Gaddafi, just like Iraq. This is about expanding Israel and about enriching the Jew bankers. If this doesn't jump out of the pages at you, you're missing something. Anyhow, so basically Churchill came right out and said it. Hitler's biggest crime was that he deprived the Jew bankers of their interest and their financing fees. Anyhow, addressing newly commissioned officers of the armed forces in May 1942, Hitler explained the challenge Germany's foreign trade treaties proposed for the USA. He described how America enjoyed an abundance of grain and natural resources, plus maintain her own manufacturing industry. Countries wishing to trade with the United States, therefore, had little to offer in exchange. So America began, quote, so America began taking gold for her labors, piling up the gold into the billions. Naturally, this mineral threatens to become utterly worthless once it's realized that a new world is forming, that no longer recognizes the concept of gold, but substitutes the concept of work and human productivity, and from then on begins to trade what is produced through labor without using gold, end quote. So he's basically saying, take the speculators out of trade. Take the parasites and middlemen out of trade. You want to produce something? That's great. We'll trade you something for it. Let's do economics without the parasites taking all of the money from the workers. It's brilliant. It's genius, and it almost worked. Anyhow, it would work if it wouldn't have been for the American and British public being fooled by the Jewish press into fighting for the Jewish banking system. That was the real purpose of this war, to stop the threat to the international Jewish banking system, which was just skimming money off the top from every people, sucking the blood from all the workers of the world. Moving on. As far as the Germans were concerned, the U.S. government and corporate America pursued the same goals. In the words of Gilsher Wirsing, there was, quote, no longer any force in the United States that could resist the unbridled domination of big business. There appeared to be no more difference between the interests of high finance and those of the state, end quote. That is key. There appears to be no difference between the interests of high finance and those of the state. In other words, the Jew bankers, the financiers, run the countries they're in, or do business in. This is pretty critical stuff, and Henry Ford talked about this too. He says, it isn't just about labor and capital, it's about finance. And I'll do Henry Ford's The International Jew for you another time. Anyhow, in Roosevelt, America elected a president inordinately concerned with foreign affairs. Quote, Roosevelt was a determined internationalist and interventionist. Jesus. Observed Congressman Hamilton Fish. The New York Times correspondent Arthur Kroc described FDR as, quote, considering himself absolutely indispensable to mankind. Oh, look at the narcissism there. A proponent of liberal democratic globalization, the new president strongly believed in the Versailles structure, Hitler's step-by-step eradication of the post-war order, German competition in European and South American markets, and the Reich's stand for sovereignty of nations over the one world concept made Roosevelt an irreconcilable enemy of Germany. And you got to remember, this is why Roosevelt stocked his whole administration with Jew bankers and gave Morgenthau, the Jew banker, absolute dictator control over the U.S. economy. And this is just like Bernard Baruch was given dictatorial control over the U.S. economy during World War I. During the peacetime years, Washington opposed Hitler's efforts to revise the Versailles Construction. In April 1933, Roosevelt told the French ambassador, quote, the situation is alarming. Hitler is a madman, and his advisors, some of whom I know personally, are crazier than he is, end quote. So far, Ambassador Hans Luther was the only German official the president had met. That's parenthetical there. FDR told his French guest, quote, France must not disarm, and no one will demand it to, end quote. A month later, Roosevelt wrote the heads of 54 countries urging disarmament. So, you know, this is very Jewish, this behavior. One face for the public and one official face that the heads of state see privately. The president discussed foreign affairs before an audience in Chicago in October 1937. And by the way, Chicago was where the Frankfurt School moved to. This is where all of these people, Adorno, Marcuse, all of these people of the Frankfurt School, this was their nest. This was the Viper's Nest, where the Frankfurt School set up shop after they got kicked out of Germany. And this is really where they got their roots into culture. They really took control, and the slow march through the institutions was completed by the late 60s. Anyhow, he told listeners, quote, the present reign of terror and international lawlessness began a few years ago, end quote, referring to Germany and Italy. Aggressor nations were supposedly, quote, piling up armament on armament. Their national income is being spent directly for armaments. It runs from 30 to as high as 50% in most of those cases, end quote. And of course, if you remember from chapters 1 and 2, Germany was spending almost nothing on defense, almost nothing on armaments. Moving on. He suggested that such diseased countries should be quarantined, in other words, economically boycotted. And if you remember, this is just President Roosevelt echoing his Jewish master's words, the Judea declares war on Germany headlines of the early 1930s. After publication of the speech, the Reich's War Ministry notified German military commanders, quote, Roosevelt's words may be regarded as America's formal decision to join the front of the democracies against the fascist states abandoning the policy of isolation, end quote. And by the way, 90% of Americans were in favor of isolation. Just like, we voted for Trump, but we're not getting it. The Jewish deep state won't let us have nationalism. They'll only make us be enforcers of Jewish internationalism. Moving on. The Reichspress described FDR's speech as the, quote, prelude to a huge armaments appropriation planned for the near future, end quote, by the Roosevelt administration. Upon orders from the White House, the U.S. Navy Captain Royal Ingersoll went to London in December to discuss fleet cooperation with the British. The prospect of American naval support against Japan, Italy, and Germany strengthened England's hand in negotiations with Hitler. The German annexation of Austria on March 12, 1938, initially produced a mild reaction from the American press and from Secretary of State Cordell Hull. This altered abruptly within 24 hours. The German ambassador reported to Berlin that the Anschluss suddenly became, quote, regarded as a breach of treaty, as militarism, as the rape of defenseless little Austria by a neighbor armed to the teeth, and as a product of policy of might makes right, end quote. So this is incredible. You got to remember, 99.78% of Austrians voted to join Germany, and 99 point something percent of Germans voted to welcome Austria to the German Empire. As the probable genesis of the about-face in American attitude, quote, as to the probable genesis of the about-face in American attitude, quote, the President personally became involved and gave both the State Department and the press corresponding guidelines, end quote. The ambassador warned the Reich's Foreign Office that were Germany ever to become involved in a conflict against England, quote, there isn't much left here that could prevent the entrance of the United States into a war against us, end quote. So the United States was already, against the will of the people, allied for a war against Germany. It just wasn't official yet. They needed Pearl Harbor, and we're going to show how that was made to happen. Such a tragedy. Such a tragedy for the American people and for everyone involved. Roosevelt reached beyond America's borders and his authority during the Sudeten crisis that September. To prevent this crucial revision of the Versailles system, he proposed to British Ambassador Sir Ronald Lindsay that the U.S. and Royal Navies blockade the entire European Atlantic coast and the Mediterranean to cut off Germany from overseas imports. That's an act of war, by the way. This is 1939. This is 2 years before America officially declares war, and FDR is declaring an economic war of embargo here. Embargo is an act of war. Sea blockades. Oh, here Tador comes out and says that. Good. Sea blockades are by international law an act of belligerency. FDR was prepared to abandon neutrality and wage war to preserve Czechoslovakia's claim to the Sudetenland. Chamberlain, wary of Roosevelt's endeavors to extend U.S. influence into Europe, rejected the idea. Quote, Washington began a savage campaign to malign the appeasers who had again backed down before the dictators, end quote. Wrote the editor of Germany's Völkischer Beobachter, International Observer. Quote, Chamberlain and Daladier were branded in the U.S. press as downright traitors to the democratic world cause, end quote. Well, here are the U.S. Jew-controlled newspapers saying, we need internationalism. We need to preserve the bank's power. And they, of course, controlled the press, so this was an uphill battle for anyone that wanted freedom, including the Germans and later the French, when they joined European liberation forces in the European War of Independence from Jewish international banking. Anyhow, in March 1941, New York businessman Theodore Kaufman published Germany Must Perish, advocating sterilization of the German population. Time magazine described it as a sensational idea. This Berlin tract depicting Kaufman at his typewriter dramatized the rising tide of anti-German sentiment in the U.S. So, Jewish-controlled American publishing and press were just stirring up the war fever against the Germans. They were advocating the sterilization of all Germans simply for having gotten off the Jew banking system. Moving on, Washington's intrigues impeded diplomatic resolution of Germany's bid for Danzig in 1939. On December 2, 1938, America's ambassador in Poland, Biddle, met with the Free Cities Commissioner Burckhardt. Burckhardt recalled, quote, declared with genuine glee that the Poles are ready to wage war over Danzig. Never since the torpedoing of the Lusitania had such religious hatred against Germany existed in America like today. Chamberlain and Daladier will be blown away by public opinion. It will be a holy war." End quote. Oh, by the way, you should look up Bernays and how he mastered propaganda and described the process of using propaganda to control populations. Actually, a Jew named Chomsky describes this very well as well. Look up Chomsky's works about Bernays-style propaganda controlling the U.S. since World War I. Moving on. Roosevelt disrupted negotiations between Germany and England regarding a trade agreement in February 1939, during which Berlin offered far-reaching concessions to improve diplomatic relations by making London a substantially better offer. In this way, he obstructed another attempt at Anglo-German reconciliation. The following month, Hans Thomsen, Ribbentrop's charge d'affaires in Washington, advised Berlin, quote, "Roosevelt is personally convinced that Germany is the enemy that must be destroyed because she is seriously disrupting the balance of power in the status quo," end quote. Well, the status quo is international Jewish tyranny through the banking system and through their control of the press. And Roosevelt was just a puppet of this system, so of course he's upset. His masters aren't happy. On March 23rd, the president promised the British to transfer more U.S. Navy warships to Hawaii, thereby freeing the English Pacific Fleet for deployment in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean. He instructed the American ambassador in London, Kennedy, to shore up Chamberlain's resolve to guarantee Poland. On FDR's instructions, the U.S. military attaché in Paris pledged American naval support to protect the French colony of Indochina from the Japanese. In this way, the president gradually increased Anglo-French dependency on the United States, indirectly augmenting his influence over the democracies in their negotiations with Hitler. The April 14th, 1939 edition of the Washington Times-Herald reported that Roosevelt was warning the English in the form of an ultimatum to make no concessions to Germany. So basically, Roosevelt was dangling the Pacific Fleet and other overseas U.S. forces as to protect overseas colonial interests of Britain and France if they ramped up the war against Germany and didn't go to the bargaining table. Of course, the U.S. is offering to act as a proxy force against the Japanese there. So, peace is stifled at every turn. The German economic miracle must be crushed before it liberates the world from the Jewish banking system. That is what you need to understand here. That is the motivation of the people that controlled the executive branch in the United States and who controlled the press in the entire West. The American ambassador in Paris, William Bullitt, informed the French government during the summer that if England and France did not come to Poland's aid in the event of a German attack, they could expect no assistance from Washington in a general European war. They could, on the other hand, reckon with the, quote, full support, unquote, of the USA if they declared war on Germany on Poland's behalf. And this is said in 1939, the year where 90% of Americans polled said they were against war in Europe, against the U.S. being involved in a war in Europe, and against U.S. aiding people that were being aggressive against Germany. 90% of Americans were against this. This is Jewish tyranny. This is the hijacking of our government and the preventing of the carrying out of the will of the people, which was not another war in Europe. The former French Foreign Minister George Bonnet later wrote that Bullitt, quote, urged France to take a strong stand against Hitler. I'm convinced also that he persuaded Daladier that Roosevelt would intervene in the war if he saw that France and England were in danger. Bullitt in 1939 did everything he could to make France enter the war, end quote. Congressman Fish concluded, quote, if Roosevelt had refrained from meddling in the European situation by encouraging England and France to believe that we would fight their battle, they would have reached an agreement by peaceful means to settle the Danzig issue and avoid the disastrous war. Excuse me. On August 17th, Hans Herbert von Bittenfeld, a traitor on the Reich's embassy staff in Moscow, disclosed information about German-Soviet negotiations to the American diplomat Charles Bolin. the German government had reassured the Kremlin that, quote, that there, quote, are no conflicts of interest between us regarding the countries from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, end quote. It was prepared to discuss, quote, every territorial question in Eastern Europe, end quote, with Stalin. The State Department's Sumner Welles relayed this intelligence to British Ambassador Lindsay. He, in turn, forwarded the news of the German-Soviet understanding, which implied dire consequences for Poland, to the Foreign Office in London. A Soviet spy there, Herbert King, notified Stalin of the intrigue. The Soviet dictator most likely assumed the British would not. The Soviet dictator most likely assumed that the British would forewarn Beck of the danger facing his country, leading him to seek rapprochement with Germany. Quote, but Stalin overestimated British and American fairness, end quote, as a German historian put it. Neither democratic government passed this vital information on to Warsaw. So basically, there was a warning that if Poland had gotten this, they would have backed down from the war footing, seeing that Poland was on the chopping block. And the American and the British Jew-controlled governments made sure that Poland didn't get this information, which wound up being a disaster for Poland and the whole world. The Jew bankers wanted their war, and they got it at all costs. Herwarth also leaked the complete text, including the secret proposal about dividing Poland, of the August 23 agreement Ribbentrop had concluded with Moscow. Bullen likewise communicated it to Washington. Bullitt, fully aware of the text and the import of the German-Soviet secret protocol, told a Polish diplomat in Paris, Count Lukasiewicz, that the document addressed only the status of the Baltic states and not Poland. As a result, Beck remained doubtful about the serious cooperation between Moscow and Berlin. This is incredible. Just information being withheld from people who need to know it at critical times to make sure that war happens. Basically, the people that were supposed to tell Poland that there was a German-Soviet pact didn't. This level of fuckery, no one ever counted on this, and Germany had no idea that this level of fuckery was going on. They thought if something happened, it was going to get out. And here the truth was being hid from poor Poland at every turn. Poland never would have gotten itself into World War II if it had known the full scoop, which the Jew-controlled state departments of Britain, France, and America made sure didn't happen. This is an international cabal of people that control the flow of information and that control state departments, and it led to World Wars I and II. Moving on, the result of Germany's rapid victory over Poland in September, France's passive strategy of defense, and England's token commitment to the Continental War was a stalemate. On October 6, 1939, Hitler addressed the Reichstag asking for a peace conference. Chamberlain himself admitted in his diary that the Führer presented some, quote, very attractive proposals, end quote. Roosevelt, however, pressured the British not to allow a second Munich. Göring, Hitler's number 2 man, met with the American Consul General in Berlin on October 9th and urged that FDR mediate peace talks. So what Roosevelt is saying is don't let another peaceful solution to a hot issue happen. The Munich Agreement led to the peaceful resolution of the Czechoslovakian issue, which led to autonomy for the Czechs and the Slovaks, not the annexation of non-German territory by Germans. And the Polish issue, now that Germany had defeated Poland, could have been peacefully resolved. Hitler had even offered after the beginning of the war to withdraw his troops back to the pre-World War II borders before the conflict broke out. At every turn, information that would lead to peace or peace talks themselves were squashed by the minions of the Jew International Banking Order. That includes Roosevelt and all these state departments and foreign ministries. Göring, Hitler's number 2 man, met with the American Consul General in Berlin on October 9th and urged that FDR mediate peace talks, offering to travel to Washington personally to represent Germany in the negotiations Göring expressed Berlin's willingness to reestablish Polish and Czech independence as a demonstration of good faith. Roosevelt formally refused to arbitrate a ceasefire. During a press conference that month, he described the German offer as a product of anonymous subordinates in the Reich's propaganda ministry and without substance. This is crazy. So the American people were being told lies. The press, the Roosevelt with his fireside chats, just were feeding lies. They're saying the Germans aren't offering peace. There's no comprehensive peace proposal here. The Germans don't really want peace. They're just looking for propaganda victories. This is the furthest thing from the truth, and this is how, along with the Jews' planning of Pearl Harbor, America got dragged into the war for European liberation from Jewish bankers. And it's a tragedy, but this is what happens when you let Jews control your media and your government. People don't get to know the knowledge they need to know, even if they're the heads of other governments involved in proxy wars. 2 American tycoons visited Germany October, hoping to open the road to negotiations. On October 19th, Göring told James Mooney, a senior executive of General Motors, quote, "If we could conclude a treaty with the English today, we'll throw Russia and Japan overboard tomorrow," end quote. Göring again offered to reinstate Poland and the Czech state to William Davis, a Texas oil magnate and on a semi-official visit to Berlin. Even American newspapers acknowledged that, considering Roosevelt's outspoken hostility towards Germany, for the Germans to nominate him and accept his judgment as arbitrator in a peace conference was a generous concession. And of course, if Roosevelt had agreed to arbitrate, he would have arbitrated so unfairly that he would have been kicked out of office. That's the point here. Upon returning home, Davis was unable to obtain an audience with the president. Hull yanked his passport to prevent Mr. Davis from returning to Europe and interfering in the progress of the war. So this is like Henry Ford, someone that tried to have peace talks and stuff and tried to be a private citizen for peace. And nope, no more going abroad to you. We're taking away your passport because, if you keep this up, peace might break out. We can't have that. Germany must perish. In Warsaw, Ribbentrop's staff compiled the pre-war diplomatic correspondence between Warsaw and its mission in Washington, London, and Paris. The Völkische Beobachter, the People's Observer, published the content on October 27th. Its editor summarized, quote, "The Polish documents prove that Roosevelt's diplomacy bears a major, if not the greatest measure of responsibility for the outbreak of the English war," end quote. One letter, for example, was from the Polish General Staff to Beck. It quoted the American military attaché, Commander Gade, as promising Poland 1,000 airplanes, quote, "as soon as the war begins," end quote. The Polish staff officer described Gade as, quote, "a man who enjoys the confidence of Roosevelt and is a personal friend of his. He is very friendly towards Germany. Personally, he is very wealthy," end quote. So it's amazing what the Germans uncovered every time they won a conflict and took control of an embassy. It's amazing just the wealth of figuring out, what's really going on once they overran different embassies and looked into the documents in there. Just constantly they saw they were being undermined and that peace was being undermined and that these countries that were puppet governments of Jew bankers were not going to allow peace to happen. They wanted Europe destroyed at all costs, and they wanted the memory of the 9 years of pre-war, the memory of the 6 wars of Jew bank-free economic blossoming in Germany. They wanted that buried under a bulldozer. They wanted that buried under the rubble of German cities. They didn't want anyone to know just how good life without Jew bankers is. Another document the Germans brought to light was a report by Count Jerzy Potocki, the former Polish ambassador in Washington, about a conversation he had with Bullitt in November 1938. Quote, "About Germany and Chancellor Hitler, he, Bullitt, spoke vehemently and with great hatred. The United States, France, and England must rearm tremendously in order to be in a position to cope with German power. Only then, when the moment is ripe," declared Bullitt further, "will one be ready for the final decision." In reply to my question whether the United States would take part in such a war, he said, Undoubtedly, yes, but only after Great Britain and France had made the first move. End quote. Ribbentrop presented the original Polish foreign policy letters to the international press for inspection. He went for the Jews. He went to the Jews, asking the Jews to print the truth about what the Jews had been up to. Good luck. The editor of the American edition of the German White Book, which published 16 of the letters in English, concluded, quote, "It is likely that they are authentic documents. This is the opinion of many Washington correspondents, including Sir Wilmot Lewis of the London Times, who might be expected to be skeptical of them." End quote. Roosevelt and Hull publicly claimed that the Polish documents were forgeries. So they weren't forgeries, but Roosevelt and Hull said they were. So Roosevelt and his Secretary of State. I mean, this is almost mind-blowing. This is just like the lead up to the Iraq War. It's all based on lies, and it's all just a bunch of different puppet politicians communicating back and forth. Yes, we're going to serve our masters. Yes, the invasion's going to happen. Yes, the war's going to happen. The truth is lies. We can't let peace break out. That would be a disaster. During this time, the White House focused on persuading Congress to amend the 1937 neutrality law. The law imposed an embargo on the sale of war materials to belligerents in Europe. Already in September, the president had managed to have the restrictions partially relaxed. As a result, U.S. arms manufacturers sold $4,400,323 worth of ordnance to France that month, and $1,422,800 worth of ordnance to England. Germany's share in armaments purchases from America, according to the State Department Bulletin of October 28, 1939, was $49. Not even $50, compared to millions going to England and France. So this is incredible. The Congress knew that America didn't want war, so they passed a 1937 law saying that the Americans cannot sell war materials to any of the parties involved in any conflict in Europe. And then Roosevelt made sure that that law got torn up. Roosevelt also had the Supreme Court completely stacked. So, yeah, this is bad news for peace. This is the bankers having their puppets do whatever is needed to get the war to happen. By the close of 1940, Britain had purchased $2.7 billion in arms from the United States. In today's dollars, that's, I don't even know, is that trillions? Roosevelt told a cabinet member, "We have been milking the British financial cow, which had plenty of milk at one time, but which has now about become dry." End quote. The president speculated on how to keep the British at war, quote, "until the supply of dollars run out." End quote. Giselher Wirsing, editor of Germany's popular Signal magazine, made this observation about the arsenal of democracy, quote, "The armaments business has grown to one of the worst rackets in American history and has amassed billions in profits through this trading in death. During 1940, there was an enormous increase in dividends, according to an exhibit of the New National City Bank in New York. The clear profit of around 2,600 shareholding companies in 1940 amounted to, holy crap, $4,253 million, or $4.253 billion, compared to $3.565 billion in 1939. Congressman Fish recalled, quote, "Roosevelt's war cabinet had a great deal of cooperation from the powerful Eastern press, largely for war. Pro-war propaganda was heavily financed by the international bankers." Wow, Fish was woke. I'm going to read that again. Congressman Fish recalled Roosevelt's war cabinet had a great deal of cooperation from the powerful Eastern press, largely for war. Pro-war propaganda was heavily financed by international bankers, armament makers, and big business, numerically few in numbers, but exceedingly powerful in financial resources and control over vast publicity and propaganda. End quote. So this is who wanted the war, the Jew bankers, and that's who got it. They didn't care whether the dollars or the pounds or the gold flowed into London or into New York, as was now the case, so long as they controlled it. And Jews controlled the financial markets of both New York and London, so they really didn't care whether America was nominally fleecing Britain or Britain was nominally getting screwed by America. All that mattered is that the money stayed in their hands, and that the German trade system of cutting out the Jew parasite middleman bankers and financiers, to make sure that this system was exterminated, that financial freedom and its memory would be destroyed and the memory extinguished. That was the point of World War II, to ensure Jewish international tyranny over finance and the media. So Reverend John McNicholas, the Archbishop of Cincinnati, remarked in January 1941, quote, 10% of our people are cunningly forcing the United States into a world conflict, while the majority of 90%, which is for peace, stands aside silently and helplessly, end quote. And here is a picture of Roosevelt sitting in a car. Says in the caption, the German media published this image of President Roosevelt wearing a Masonic ring emphasizing his affiliation with Freemasonry, a worldwide society influential in political and economic affairs. This was to support charges, both German propaganda and American isolationists, that FDR was an internationalist. And, of course, if you look at FDR's speeches, yes, he openly admits he's an internationalist. He's for the destruction of all nations and all freedom, and the tyranny of the international Jewish bankers, and the destruction of all things beautiful in this world, and the replacement with Jewish materialism. Moving on, as Congress eased restrictions on selling weapons to belligerents, America provided logistical support for England to continue the war. Under Washington's leadership, the Western Hemisphere countries proclaimed a nautical security zone southward from Canada. This zone, 300 to 1,000 miles wide in places, was off limits to combat operations of warring powers. Hitler ordered his navy to refrain from attacking British merchant vessels inside this belt. It substantially reduced the sea lanes the English Royal Navy had to patrol to guard cargo ships en route to Britain. U.S. warships eventually assisted in protecting convoys, monitoring movements of German U-boats, and reporting their findings to the Royal Navy. So, the U.S., which was 90% against going to war with Germany, with the Jew bankers in charge with their puppet Roosevelt, was already at war with Germany. Germany should have ignored these "you can't attack your enemy's ships here" orders that they were getting from the U.S. They should have just sank all the British merchant ships until, regardless of where they were, until Britain surrendered and its people were liberated from the Jew banking system. Hitler didn't want to occupy England. He wanted to liberate England. During September 1941, Roosevelt decided to become, quote, more provocative, end quote, adding that if Germans, quote, did not like it if they could attack American forces. Oh, adding, I'm going to stop here for a bit. I need a rest. I'm pretty tired. Restream.io last time cut off about 10 minutes before the recording finished transmitting over Restream.io to YouTube, so I'm just going to start playing music now, and hopefully YouTube doesn't truncate the end of this like it did the last one. It's been chopping off 40 or 50% of my broadcast once the video is done streaming, and I've got an offline recording, so I don't care, but I'll just go ahead and leave the words of John F. Kennedy here. You got to remember Joseph Kennedy, John and Bobby Kennedy's father, so President Kennedy's father, and presidential likely Bobby Kennedy, the candidate's father, who made AIPAC its former the forerunner to AIPAC, the Zionist agency or whatever it was called, register as a foreign agent. This is what got both Kennedys killed. Senator Kennedy, JFK and Bobby Kennedy's father, was woke to the JQ, and he made sure he raised his sons woke to the JQ. And here's John F. Kennedy talking about the JQ. Got to remember, 90% of Americans did not want American involvement in the Second World War, and we were dragged into it kicking and screaming to save the Jew bankers. And there's going to be plenty more passages throughout this book where Senator Kennedy rears his Jew name in the head again and goes ahead and just says who really caused World War II. Where is it?
Michael Cohen just confirmed in front of the American public.
You say that 50 years ago, Kennedy delivered what you said made peace with the Soviets.
Where the hell is it? Oh, now YouTube isn't letting me find it. Anyhow, the video should have caught up now, so I'm gonna cut it off now. I'm feeling a little under the weather, still sick. I'm gonna lay down for a bit and hopefully finish reading you the rest of Chapter 4 of Hitler's Revolution later on today. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to be with you again real soon, maybe an hour or two from now.